Behind an inn in the Wyoming Territory on Christmas Eve, a woman in a red wedding dress froze to death, or should have. Mei Lin had survived the ocean crossing, survived 15 months of promises written by a stranger, survived the moment that stranger took one look at her face and called her worthless. But as midnight crept toward the coldest hour and her fingers lost all feeling, she understood survival was only the beginning. The real question was whether she'd still be human when morning came, or just another body the frontier swallowed whole. If you want to see how far a woman can fall before she learns to stand, stay until the end. And comment your city below. I want to know how far this story travels. The wind off the mountain came down like punishment. Mei Lin pressed herself tighter against the wall behind the broken spoke inn, where the wood still held some memory of the kitchen fire burning on the other side. Her wedding dress, red silk embroidered with gold thread, meant to announce joy, clung to her like a wet flag. The hem was black with mud and snow. The sleeves were torn where she'd caught them on a fence while running from the man who was supposed to become her husband. She had no coat, no blanket, no money. The broker had taken the money. Her fingers were past aching now. They'd gone white, then red, and now they simply didn't respond when she tried to curl them into fists. She tucked them under her arms and breathed into the small space between her chest and her knees, trying to make her body into a stove that could burn nothing but itself. Somewhere inside the inn, men were singing. The sound leaked through the clapboard walls, off-key, whiskey-soaked, full of the kind of joy that came easy when you had a roof and a fire and no reason to think the world might kill you by morning. Mei Lin listened and hated them, not for their warmth, for their carelessness, for the way they could laugh on the same night she'd been thrown away like spoiled meat. She pulled her knees closer. It had been 16 hours since the stagecoach left her standing in front of the mercantile with her single trunk and a name written on a piece of paper. Henry Caldwell, businessman, owns the lumber mill. The broker, a man named Seward with a thin mustache and teeth the color of old soap, had walked her to the mill himself. He'd knocked on the office door and stepped aside, smiling like a dog that had fetched something dead and expected praise. Henry Caldwell had opened the door. He was tall, pale, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that looked like it had never been surprised by anything. He'd looked at Mei Lin for 3 full seconds, his gaze moving from her face to her dress to the trunk at her feet, and then he'd looked at Seward. "This is the bride?" "Yes, sir. Fresh off the stage, just like you ordered." Caldwell's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a sneer, something worse. "I ordered a woman, not a—" He paused, as if searching for a word that wouldn't dirty his mouth. "Not this." Mei Lin's English was good enough to understand. Her shame was fluent. "Now, Mr. Caldwell," Seward had said, his voice turning slick and eager, "we had an agreement. You paid half up front. For a white woman, or at least someone who could pass." Caldwell's eyes didn't leave Mei Lin's face. She felt his disgust like a hand around her throat. "I'm not marrying a celestial. I won't have my children look like that." Seward shifted his weight. "Sir, the contract doesn't specify—" "I don't care what the contract says." Caldwell reached into his coat and pulled out a slim wallet. He counted bills onto the doorframe without looking at them. "Here's the rest of your fee. Take her back. Sell her to a ranch hand or a miner. I don't care. But if she's still in this town by tomorrow, I'll make sure every man here knows you're peddling damaged goods." The bills disappeared into Seward's pocket. Mei Lin's voice came out small and sharp, like something broken. "You took my money." Both men looked at her as if the trunk had spoken. "The travel fee?" she said, forcing her English past the tightness in her chest. $50. You took it in San Francisco. You said it was for the stagecoach and the lodging and—" "Services rendered," Seward said smoothly. "You got here, didn't you? You said I would have a home. And you would have, if you'd been worth marrying." He turned back to Caldwell, dismissing her like a servant. "Pleasure doing business, sir." Caldwell stepped back into his office and closed the door. Seward grabbed Mei Lin's arm and pulled her away from the mill, back toward the main street. She stumbled, her trunk forgotten, her mind still trying to catch up to what had just happened. He didn't let go until they were standing in the alley beside the broken spoke, where the mud was deep and the shadows were thick and no one decent would see. "You listen to me," Seward hissed, his breath sour with tobacco. You've got two choices. You can work off your debt on your back, or you can get out of town before someone decides to collect it another way. Either way, you don't say my name. You don't mention Henry Caldwell. You don't make trouble. Understood? Maylin jerked her arm free. Seward smiled. That's what I thought. He walked away. And Maylin stood there, in a red wedding dress, in a town where no one knew her name, holding nothing but the fact that she had survived the last 5 minutes and might not survive the next 5 hours. She'd tried the front door of the inn first. The woman behind the counter had looked her up and down and said, "We don't rent to your kind." Maylin had asked if there was work, cleaning, cooking, anything. The woman had laughed. "Not on Christmas Eve, honey. Come back when you've got money, or a white face." So Maylin had walked. She'd tried the mercantile, the boarding house, the church. Every door had been the same. Polite refusals or blunt rejections, depending on how tired the person answering was. By the time the sun started to set, she understood. She was invisible unless she was inconvenient. And tonight, she was both. She'd found the space behind the inn by accident, chasing the smell of cooking meat, and the hope that someone might pity her enough to offer scraps. But the back door was locked, and the windows were too high, and eventually she'd just sunk down against the wall because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. That had been hours ago. Now the wind was picking up, and the snow was starting to fall in earnest, and Maylin's thoughts were coming slower, like a clock winding down. She thought about her mother. Her mother, who had sold her to the marriage broker because there were 3 younger children and not enough rice, and because Maylin was 17 and old enough to carry her own weight somewhere else. Her mother, who had cried when the broker came but had still taken the money. Her mother, who had said, "America is full of good men who need wives. You'll have a better life." Maylin closed her eyes. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to hate her mother, hate Seward, hate Henry Caldwell, and every person in this town who had looked at her like she was something they could step over. But anger took energy, and she didn't have any left. What she had was cold. It started in her fingers and toes, crept up her arms and legs, settled into her chest like a stone. She stopped shivering. That was supposed to be bad, wasn't it? She'd heard that once. When you stopped shivering, it meant your body was giving up. She thought that might be a relief. Footsteps. Maylin's eyes snapped open. 2 men stood at the mouth of the alley, backlit by the yellow glow of the inn's front windows. One was tall and broad-shouldered, swaying slightly. The other was smaller, sharper, moving with the kind of predatory ease that made Maylin's stomach clench. The smaller man stepped closer. Seward. "Well, well," he said, his voice cheerful in a way that made her skin crawl. "Still here, are we?" Maylin tried to stand. Her legs buckled. She caught herself against the wall, her vision swimming. "Told you she'd still be around," Seward said to the other man. "No money, no friends, no way out." "Perfect." The tall man grunted. He smelled like whiskey and sweat. "She don't look like much." "She doesn't have to look like much. She just has to work." Seward crouched in front of Maylin, his smile wide and empty. "Here's the thing, sweetheart. You owe me. And I know a man who runs a house about 20 miles south of here. He's always looking for girls. Doesn't care what they look like, long as they can lie still. You come with me now, quiet-like, and I'll make sure you get there in one piece. You give me trouble, and my friend here will make sure you regret it. What do you say?" Maylin stared at him. Her body was shutting down. Her mind was sluggish. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the cold and the fear and the exhaustion, something sparked. Not hope, rage. She spat in his face. Seward recoiled, wiping his cheek, and his smile vanished. "You little—" The tall man grabbed Maylin's arm and hauled her upright. Pain shot through her shoulder. She gasped, tried to pull away, but he was too strong and she was too weak, and the world tilted sideways as he shoved her against the wall. "Hold her," Seward said, his voice flat now. "Businesslike." The tall man pinned her wrists above her head with one hand. Maylin kicked, but her legs had no strength. She opened her mouth to scream, and Seward's hand clamped over it, hard enough to make her teeth cut the inside of her cheek. "No one's going to hear you," he said softly. "And even if they did, no one's going to care." Maylin bit down. Seward swore and jerked his hand back. Blood welled on his palm. He raised his other hand, and Maylin braced for the blow. "Let her go!" The voice came from the darkness behind them, low, calm. the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. Seward froze. The tall man's grip loosened just slightly, and Mei Lin twisted her head to see. A man stood at the mouth of the alley. He was tall, taller than Seward's companion, and broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested strength earned through use, not show. He wore a long coat dusted with snow, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and his hands hung loose at his sides. One hand rested near the grip of a revolver on his hip. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the light from the street, cold, steady. Seward straightened, his salesman's smile snapping back into place. "Evening, friend. Just having a conversation here. Nothing that concerns you." The man didn't move. Didn't look like a conversation. Well, appearances can be deceiving. Seward stepped away from Mei Lin, his hand spread in a gesture of innocence. "This girl's got debts. We're just helping her settle them." "That's so." The man's gaze shifted to Mei Lin. She was still pinned against the wall, her dress torn at the shoulder, blood on her lip. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. "She agree to that?" "She doesn't have a choice," the tall man said, his voice thick with drink and bravado. "So why don't you move along before—" He didn't finish. The man in the coat moved. It wasn't fast, exactly. It was efficient. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, caught the tall man's wrist, and twisted. There was a wet pop, a howl of pain, and suddenly Mei Lin was free, stumbling sideways as the tall man dropped to his knees, cradling his arm. Seward reached for something in his coat. The man's revolver cleared leather before Seward's hand found whatever he was looking for. The hammer clicked back, loud as a bone breaking, and Seward went very still. "Don't," the man said quietly. Seward raised his hands. The man kept the gun level. "You've got 10 seconds to get out of my sight. After that, I stop being polite." "Now listen here." 7 seconds. Seward's jaw worked. Then he grabbed his companion by the collar and hauled him to his feet. "This isn't over," he muttered, but he was already backing toward the street. The man didn't lower the gun until they were gone. Then he holstered it, turned, and looked at Mei Lin. She was still standing, barely, her back pressed to the wall. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to clench them into fists to make them stop. The man studied her for a long moment. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth in a way that suggested he'd spent more time squinting into the sun than smiling. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale, clear, unreadable. "You hurt?" he asked. Mei Lin shook her head. Then, because that was a lie, she nodded. The man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Can you walk?" She didn't know. She pushed off the wall and took a step. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of a crate, her vision going white at the edges, and the man moved forward and caught her elbow before she hit the ground. His grip was firm but not rough. He steadied her, waited until her breathing evened out, then let go. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked. Mei Lin almost laughed. It came out as a cough. "No." "Family? Friends?" "No." "Money?" She shook her head. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he shrugged out of his coat and held it out to her. Mei Lin stared at it. "Take it," he said. "You're gonna freeze like I—" Her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." She took the coat. It was heavy, lined with wool, and it smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else she couldn't name. She pulled it around her shoulders, and the warmth was so sudden and so complete that her eyes stung. The man watched her. Then he tipped his hat back slightly, revealing more of his face. There were scars there, one along his jaw, another across his brow. His expression was unreadable. "Name's Caleb Rourke," he said. "I've got a ranch about 6 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's food. You can stay the night. After that, you do what you want." Mei Lin's throat tightened. "Why?" Caleb tilted his head slightly, as if the question surprised him. "Because it's Christmas Eve," he said, "and because no one should spend it like this." He turned and started walking toward the street. Mei Lin stood there, clutching the coat, her mind spinning. Every instinct she had screamed that this was a trap, that men didn't help women for free, that kindness was just another word for control. But then she thought about Seward's hands on her wrists, about the cold creeping into her bones, about the way Henry Caldwell had looked at her like she was nothing, and she thought, what's the worst that could happen? She was already ruined, already alone, already dying. At least if she went with Caleb Rourke, she'd die warm. She took a step, then another. Her legs were unsteady, but they held. Caleb glanced back, saw her following, and nodded once. He didn't slow down, but he didn't speed up either. He just walked, and Mei Lin walked behind him, and the snow fell soft and silent around them both. They passed through the main street, where a few men still lingered outside the saloon, smoking and talking in low voices. One of them saw Caleb and straightened, his hand moving toward his gun. Caleb looked at him. Didn't say anything, just looked. The man's hand dropped. They kept walking. At the edge of town, a horse and wagon waited in the shadow of the livery stable. The horse was a big gray gelding with kind eyes and a patient stance. Caleb checked the harness, then climbed up onto the bench and offered Mei Lin his hand. She hesitated. I'm not going to hurt you, Caleb said quietly, but I'm also not going to leave you here. So you've got a choice. Get in or don't. Mei Lin looked back at the town, at the lights in the windows, at the people inside who had turned her away. She took his hand. He pulled her up onto the bench beside him, and she settled into the seat, wrapping his coat tighter around herself. Caleb picked up the reins, clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward. The town fell away behind them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, and the wind moving through the pines. Mei Lin kept her eyes on the road ahead, her hands tucked under her arms, her mind circling the same question over and over. Who is this man? Finally, she said, You didn't ask my name. Caleb glanced at her. Didn't figure you'd want to give it. She blinked. That was true. She hadn't wanted to attach herself to anything, even something as small as a name. But now, sitting beside him in the dark, she felt the absence of it, like she'd lost something she hadn't known she was carrying. Mei Lin, she said quietly. Caleb nodded. Mei Lin, he repeated, testing the shape of it. His pronunciation wasn't perfect, but it was careful, respectful. That's a good name. She didn't know what to say to that. They rode in silence for another mile. Then Mei Lin said, Why were you in town? Supplies, Caleb said, and checking the mail. On Christmas Eve? Best time, fewer people. Mei Lin frowned. You don't like people? Caleb's mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile. I like them fine. From a distance. She understood that. The road climbed into the hills, winding between stands of pine and aspen. The snow was deeper here, muffling the world, and the stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in the sky. Mei Lin had never seen stars like this. In San Francisco, the sky had been washed out by city lights. Here, it was endless. How much farther? She asked. Another hour. Mei Lin nodded. She was warm now, wrapped in Caleb's coat, but the exhaustion was catching up to her. Her eyelids felt heavy. Her thoughts kept drifting. She didn't realize she'd fallen asleep until the wagon stopped. She jerked awake, her heart hammering, and Caleb was already climbing down from the bench. He moved around to her side and offered his hand again. We're here, he said. Mei Lin took his hand and let him help her down. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the ride, and she nearly fell, but Caleb steadied her. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the house. It was small, a single-story cabin built from rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Light glowed in the windows, warm and yellow, and smoke curled from the chimney into the night sky. It looked like something out of a dream. Caleb led the way up the porch steps and opened the door. Heat rolled out like a wave. Mei Lin stepped inside and stopped. The cabin was one large room divided by function rather than walls. A kitchen occupied one corner, with a cast-iron stove and a scarred wooden table. A sitting area filled another corner, with a pair of mismatched chairs and a threadbare rug. A ladder led up to a loft, where she could see the edge of a quilt hanging over a railing. And standing in the middle of the room, staring at her with wide eyes, were 4 children. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12, with dark hair pulled into a braid and a face that was all sharp angles and suspicion. The next was a boy, 10 or so, with freckles and a gap-toothed grin. Then another girl, smaller, maybe 7, clutching a rag doll. And finally, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, half hidden behind his sister's skirts. They looked at Mei Lin. Mei Lin looked at them. No one spoke. Caleb closed the door behind them and hung his hat on a peg. "This is Mei Lin," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "She's staying the night." The oldest girl's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I said so." "But, Emma." Caleb's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. "Not now." Emma's jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. Caleb looked at Mei Lin. "You hungry?" Mei Lin nodded. She was beyond hungry. She was hollow. "Sit," Caleb said, nodding toward the table. "I'll make something." Mei Lin sat. The children didn't move. They just stood there, watching her like she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. Mei Lin didn't blame them. She felt like a puzzle herself. Caleb moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He pulled a pot from the stove, ladled stew into a bowl, and set it in front of Mei Lin along with a chunk of bread. Then he poured a cup of water and placed that beside the bowl. "Eat," he said. Mei Lin picked up the spoon. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She forced herself to hold on, dipped the spoon into the stew, and brought it to her mouth. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. Not because it was fancy. It wasn't. It was simple. Venison, potatoes, carrots, onions, but it was hot and rich and real, and Mei Lin had to stop herself from crying as she swallowed. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, but her body had other ideas. Within minutes, the bowl was empty. She looked up and found Caleb watching her. "More?" he asked. She nodded. He refilled the bowl without comment. This time, Mei Lin ate more carefully. She was aware of the children still watching, of Caleb moving around the kitchen, of the fire crackling in the stove. She was aware, too, of the fact that this was the first time in 16 hours that she'd felt safe. It wouldn't last. She knew that. But for now, it was enough. When she finished the second bowl, Caleb took it and set it in the wash basin. Then he turned to the children. "Bed," he said. The youngest boy whined. The middle girl yawned. The older boy groaned, but Emma just stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Mei Lin. "She's not staying," Emma said. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Yes, she is. We don't have room. We'll make room. Why? We don't even know her. That's enough." Caleb's voice was still calm, but there was iron underneath. "You've got 5 minutes to get upstairs. After that, I'm coming up there, and you won't like it." Emma's face flushed. She opened her mouth, closed it, then spun on her heel and marched toward the ladder. The other children followed, casting glances back at Mei Lin as they climbed. When they were gone, the cabin fell silent. Caleb sat down across from Mei Lin. He didn't say anything, just sat there, his hands folded on the table, his gaze steady. Mei Lin shifted in her seat. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't." "Your daughter doesn't want me here." Caleb's mouth twitched. "Emma doesn't want anyone here. Don't take it personal." Mei Lin didn't know how else to take it. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "You can sleep by the stove tonight. It'll be warm. I'll bring down some blankets. And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow you decide what you want to do." Mei Lin frowned. "What if I want to stay?" Caleb studied her. "Then you stay." "Just like that?" "Just like that." She didn't believe him. Couldn't. Men didn't offer things for free. There was always a price. But Caleb stood, climbed the ladder, and returned a few minutes later with a pile of quilts and a pillow. He spread them out near the stove, making a bed that looked softer than anything Mei Lin had slept on in months. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." Mei Lin watched him climb the ladder again, watched him disappear into the loft, heard the creak of a bed frame, the murmur of a child's voice, the low rumble of Caleb's reply. She lay down on the quilts. The fire crackled. The warmth soaked into her bones. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, everything was still. Mei Lin closed her eyes, and for the first time in 16 hours, she let herself believe she might survive this. Mei Lin woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of children arguing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was rough timber, not the cracked plaster of the boarding house in San Francisco. The air was warm but carried the scent of pine and wood smoke instead of salt and fish. And the voices, high-pitched, insistent, layered over each other like birds fighting over scraps, were unfamiliar. Then she remembered. The alley, the snow, the man with the gun, and the quiet voice. Caleb Rourke. She sat up slowly, her body protesting. Every muscle ached, her shoulder throbbed where the drunk man had grabbed her, and her fingers were stiff and swollen from the cold. But she was warm. The quilts were heavy and soft, and the stove beside her radiated heat like a second sun. She folded the blankets carefully, stacking them in a neat pile, and stood. Her red wedding dress was wrinkled and stained, the hem still black with mud. She looked like something dragged through a storm and left to dry. Across the room, the children sat at the table, eating bowls of porridge. Emma, the oldest girl, was glaring at the freckled boy, who was grinning like he'd just won something. The smaller girl, the one with the doll, was spooning porridge into her mouth with mechanical precision, her eyes distant. The youngest boy sat beside her, his face smeared with oats, kicking his feet against the chair legs. Caleb stood at the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He glanced up when Mei Lin moved, nodded once, and turned back to the pot. "There's porridge," he said. "Help yourself." Mei Lin hesitated. The children had all stopped eating and were staring at her now. Emma's expression was openly hostile. The freckled boy looked curious. The smaller girl didn't seem to register her presence at all. "Sit down," Caleb said, not unkindly. "Food's getting cold." Mei Lin crossed to the table and lowered herself into the empty chair at the end. Caleb set a bowl in front of her, then the tin cup. The coffee was black and strong, and when she sipped it, the bitterness made her eyes water. But it was hot, and that was enough. She picked up the spoon and ate. The porridge was plain, oats, salt, a little butter, but it was filling. She ate slowly, aware of the children watching her every move. Emma's gaze burned like a brand. The freckled boy kept opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again when Emma shot him a look. Finally, the boy couldn't contain himself. "Are you really from China?" "Ben?" Emma hissed. "What? I'm just asking." Mei Lin swallowed her mouthful of porridge and nodded. "Yes." Ben's eyes went wide. "Did you come on a ship?" "Ben, I came on a ship," Mei Lin said quietly. She looked at Emma. "Is that a problem?" Emma's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Caleb leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. He didn't intervene, didn't tell Emma to be polite or Ben to stop asking questions. He just watched. "What's your name?" Ben asked, pointing at the smaller girl with the doll. "That's Lily," Ben said when the girl didn't respond. "She doesn't talk much." "And that's Samuel," he added, nodding at the youngest boy. "He talks too much." "Do not." Samuel protested, his voice high and indignant. "Do too. Do not." "Enough," Caleb said quietly. Both boys fell silent. Caleb pushed off the counter and picked up a coat from the peg by the door. "I've got work to do. Ben, you're with me. Emma, you watch the little ones." Emma's eyes flashed. Why can't she watch them? She jerked her chin toward Mei Lin. "Because I told you to," Caleb said. He pulled on the coat, settled his hat on his head, and opened the door. Cold air rushed in. "Ben! Now!" Ben scrambled up from the table, grabbing his own coat and shoving his arms into the sleeves. He shot Mei Lin a grin as he passed, then hurried out after Caleb. The door closed behind them, and the cabin fell into uneasy silence. Emma stood and began clearing the bowls with sharp, deliberate movements. She didn't look at Mei Lin, didn't speak, just worked with the kind of furious efficiency that said she was angry and had no outlet for it. Lily slid off her chair and wandered to the corner where a basket of wooden blocks sat. She knelt beside it and began stacking them, one on top of the other, her movements slow and precise. Samuel followed her, chattering about something that made no sense, and Lily ignored him completely. Mei Lin finished her porridge and stood. She carried her bowl to the wash basin and set it beside the others. Emma stopped scrubbing and turned. "What do you think you're doing?" Mei Lin blinked. "Helping. I don't need your help." "I know." Emma stared at her as if trying to decide whether that was an insult. Then she turned back to the basin and attacked the bowls with renewed vigor. Mei Lin stood there for a moment, unsure. Then she moved to the corner where Lily and Samuel played. She lowered herself onto the floor, her dress pooling around her, and watched as Lily added another block to her tower. "That's a tall tower," Mei Lin said softly. Lily didn't respond, didn't even glance up. Samuel, however, scooted closer. "She's building a castle for the princess." He held up a small wooden horse. "And this is the night. He's going to save her." Mei Lin looked at the tower, at the careful way Lily placed each block, at the concentration on her small face. "The princess doesn't need saving," Mei Lin said. Samuel frowned. "Yes, she does. That's how the story goes. Maybe the princess saves herself." Samuel considered this. Then he shrugged and galloped his horse across the floor, making whinnying sounds. Lily's tower wobbled. One block slipped, then another, and the whole thing collapsed in a soft clatter. Lily stared at the ruins, her face blank, and for a moment Mei Lin thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just reached for another block and started building again. Mei Lin understood that. She stayed on the floor with the children until the sun climbed higher and the light through the windows turned sharp and white. Emma finished the dishes and moved to the stove where she began mixing something in a bowl. Flour, water, lard. Biscuits, maybe. She worked in silence, her shoulders tight, her movements precise. Mei Lin wanted to speak, wanted to say something that would ease the tension, but she didn't know what, and Emma didn't seem like the kind of girl who would accept comfort from a stranger. So Mei Lin said nothing. The door opened and Caleb and Ben came in on a gust of cold air. Both were red-cheeked and dusted with snow. Ben was grinning. Caleb's expression was as unreadable as ever. "Fence is mended," Caleb said, stomping the snow off his boots. "We'll check the rest of the line tomorrow." He looked at Mei Lin, still sitting on the floor with the children. "You sleep all right?" Mei Lin nodded. "Yes. Thank you." "Good." He pulled off his coat and hat, hung them up, and crossed to the stove. He poured himself another cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on Emma. "How long till those biscuits are ready?" "Another hour," Emma said without looking up. "Make extra. We've got company." Emma's hands stilled. "She's staying?" "For now." "For how long?" "As long as she needs to." Emma's jaw clenched. She didn't argue, but the silence that followed was louder than words. Mei Lin stood, brushing off her dress. "I should go." Caleb looked at her. "Go where?" She didn't have an answer. "That's what I thought," Caleb said. He took a sip of his coffee. "You can stay. Work if you want to. Rest if you don't. But you're not going back out there with nothing." "I don't want charity," Mei Lin said, her voice sharper than she intended. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Didn't offer charity. Offered a roof and a meal. What you do with it is up to you." He set down his cup and walked to the door. "Ben, come on. Barn needs mucking out." Ben groaned but followed. When they were gone, Mei Lin turned to find Emma watching her. "He feels sorry for you," Emma said flatly. "That's why you're here." Mei Lin met her gaze. "I know." "Then why are you staying?" "Because I have nowhere else to go." Emma's eyes narrowed. "You're going to leave, just like everyone else." Mei Lin didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if it was true or not, so she said the only thing she could. "Maybe." Emma turned back to her dough, her hands working it with unnecessary force. Mei Lin watched her for a moment. Then she crossed to the wash basin and picked up a rag. "Show me what needs doing." Emma looked at her, really looked, for the first time. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to stay, I should earn it." Emma's expression flickered. Surprise, suspicion, something else Mei Lin couldn't name. Then she jerked her chin toward the corner. "Floor needs sweeping, laundry needs folding, and someone has to watch the little ones so they don't burn the place down." Mei Lin nodded. "I can do that." She picked up the broom and started sweeping. The days that followed blurred together. Mei Lin woke before dawn, when the cabin was still dark and cold. She would stoke the fire, put on the coffee, and start the porridge while Caleb dressed and the children slept. By the time the sun rose, breakfast was ready, and Caleb would take Ben outside to tend the animals, horses, a milk cow, chickens. while Emma woke the younger ones. Mei Lin learned the rhythm of the house quickly. Emma was the one who ran things when Caleb was working. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and kept Samuel and Lily from killing themselves or each other. She was 12 years old and carried herself like she was twice that. She didn't ask for help, and she didn't offer thanks when it was given, but she also didn't send Mei Lin away. Ben was easier. He talked constantly about the horses, the snow, the fox he'd seen by the creek, the time he'd tried to ride the cow and ended up in the mud. He asked Mei Lin questions about China, about the ocean, about whether she'd ever seen a dragon. She answered when she could and smiled when she couldn't. He didn't seem to mind either way. Lily was silent. She ate when food was put in front of her, dressed when clothes were laid out, and played with her blocks or her doll for hours without making a sound. Mei Lin had tried speaking to her a few times, but Lily never responded, just looked through her as if Mei Lin were made of glass. Samuel was 4 and chaos personified. He climbed things he shouldn't, ate things he shouldn't, and asked questions that had no answers. But when he laughed, the whole cabin seemed brighter. And Caleb was a shadow. He rose before everyone, worked until sundown, and spoke only when necessary. He was never harsh, but he was never warm either. He moved through the house like a man fulfilling a duty, not living a life. Mei Lin watched him when he wasn't looking, watched the way he moved, deliberate, economical, as if every motion had been calculated to avoid waste, watched the way he spoke to the children, firm but never cruel, clear but never loud. Watched the way he cleaned his gun every night before bed, his hand steady and sure. She didn't ask about his past, didn't ask about the children, or why a man like him was raising 4 of them alone. She figured he'd tell her if he wanted to, and if he didn't, that was his right. 3 days after she arrived, Mei Lin was folding laundry when Emma spoke. "They're not his." Mei Lin looked up. Emma was kneading bread dough, her back to Mei Lin, her voice flat. "What?" "The children. We're not his." Mei Lin set down the shirt she was folding. "Whose are you?" "Nobody's." Emma punched the dough. "We're just leftovers." Mei Lin frowned. "I don't understand." Emma turned, her face hard. "Ben's folks died of fever 2 years ago. Lily's mother abandoned her at a church. Samuel's father sold him to a man who beat him. And She stopped, her jaw working. "Doesn't matter. Point is, we didn't have anywhere to go, so Caleb took us in." "Why?" Emma shrugged. "He doesn't say. Just shows up at the orphanage or the sheriff's office or wherever, takes a kid home and adds another bed to the loft." She turned back to the dough. "But he doesn't want us." "Not really. He's just doing his duty, same as you." Mei Lin's chest tightened. "He seems like he cares." "He keeps us fed. That's not the same thing." Mei Lin wanted to argue. Wanted to say that keeping 4 children fed and clothed and safe was more than most people would do. But she didn't, because she understood what Emma wasn't saying. Caring and keeping weren't the same, and maybe Emma was right. Maybe Caleb was just a man doing what he thought was right, even if his heart wasn't in it. But Mei Lin had seen the way he steadied Samuel when the boy tripped, the way he let Ben talk his ear off without complaint, the way he made sure Lily's doll was never left outside in the cold. That wasn't duty. Or if it was duty that looked an awful lot like love. A week after Mei Lin arrived, the snow came in earnest. It fell for 3 days straight, heavy and silent, until the world outside the cabin disappeared beneath a blanket of white. The drifts climbed halfway up the windows. The wind howled like something alive, and the cold pressed against the walls like it wanted in. Caleb spent the first day clearing paths to the barn and the woodpile. He came in after dark, his face raw and red, his hands so stiff he could barely hold a cup. Mei Lin heated water and poured it into a basin, and Caleb soaked his hands without a word. The second day, he stayed inside. He mended harnesses, sharpened knives, and taught Ben how to tie knots. Mei Lin worked beside Emma, cooking and cleaning and trying to keep the little ones entertained. The cabin felt smaller with all of them trapped inside, the walls pressing in, but no one complained. On the third day, the storm broke. The wind died. The snow stopped. And when Mei Lin opened the door to check the woodpile, the silence was so complete it felt like the world had ended. Caleb stepped out onto the porch beside her. He looked at the landscape, white and vast and empty, and exhaled slowly. We'll need to check the livestock, he said. I can help, Maylin offered. Caleb glanced at her. She was wearing Emma's spare coat, too big in the shoulders, and a pair of boots that didn't quite fit. Her hands were red from washing dishes in cold water, and her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth. You ever worked a ranch before? Caleb asked. No. Can you carry a bucket? Yes. Then let's go. The barn was a short walk from the cabin, but the snow was deep, and Maylin's legs burned by the time they reached it. Caleb pushed open the door, and warm, hay-scented air rolled out. Inside, the horses shifted in their stalls, and the cow lowed softly. Caleb moved through the space with practiced ease, checking hooves, running his hands along flanks, murmuring low words Maylin couldn't hear. She followed his lead, carrying water, forking hay, trying not to get in the way. At one point, Caleb stopped and looked at her. You're good at this. Maylin blinked. At what? Not complaining. She almost laughed. What would complaining do? Nothing. But most people do it anyway. He turned back to the horses, and Maylin felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something quieter, something like recognition. That night, after the children were asleep, Maylin sat by the fire, mending one of Samuel's shirts. The fabric was worn thin in places, but she patched it carefully, her stitches small and even. Caleb sat across from her, cleaning his gun. The lamplight caught the edge of the barrel, turning it gold. You don't have to stay, he said quietly. Maylin's hand stilled. I know. I mean it. Soon as the road's clear, I can take you back to town, or to the next settlement, wherever you want to go. And if I don't want to go anywhere? Caleb looked up. His eyes were steady, unreadable. Then you stay. Just like that? Just like that. Maylin set down the shirt. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Helping me. Letting me stay. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, No one should be left in the cold. It wasn't an answer. Not really, but it was the truth. Maylin picked up the shirt again. I'll stay. For now. Caleb nodded and went back to his gun. 2 weeks after Maylin arrived, the sky turned clear and brittle, and the temperature dropped so low that the water in the wash basin froze overnight. Caleb was outside before dawn, checking the animals, and when he came back in, his face was grim. Storm's coming, he said. Bigger than the last one. We need supplies. From town? Emma asked. From town. Emma's expression tightened. I'll go with you. No, you stay with the little ones. But, Emma. Caleb's voice was firm. I need you here. Emma's jaw clenched, but she nodded. Caleb looked at Maylin. You know how to shoot? No. Then you're learning. He pulled a rifle from the rack on the wall and handed it to her. It was heavier than she expected, the metal cold against her palms. Why do I need this? She asked. Because I'll be gone most of the day. And if someone comes looking for trouble, I want you to be able to stop it. Maylin's stomach twisted. You think Seward will come back? I think men like Seward don't forget. He took the rifle and showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to fire. She practiced until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. By the time Caleb was satisfied, the sun was high and the wagon was loaded. Keep the door locked, Caleb said to Emma. Don't open it for anyone but me. I know, Emma said. Caleb climbed onto the wagon and picked up the reins. He looked at Maylin one last time. You'll be fine. Maylin nodded. She didn't believe him. The wagon rolled away, and the cabin fell silent. The hours dragged. Emma kept the children busy with chores and games, and Maylin helped where she could. But her mind kept circling back to the rifle propped by the door, to the way Caleb's face had looked when he mentioned Seward, to the knowledge that they were 6 miles from anywhere, and if something went wrong, no one would hear them scream. The sun was setting when the knock came, 3 sharp raps on the door. Emma went pale. Lily clutched her doll. Ben looked at Maylin. Stay here, Maylin said quietly. She crossed to the door, her heart hammering, and picked up the rifle. Who is it? She called. A friend of Mr. Rourke's, a voice said. Smooth, familiar, Seward. Maylin's hands tightened on the rifle. He's not here. I know. That's why I came now. Leave. Now, that's not very neighborly. Seward's voice was closer now, right on the other side of the door. I just want to talk. We have nothing to talk about. I think we do. See, you owe me, girl. And I'm not a patient man. Maylin raised the rifle and aimed it at the door. If you don't leave, I'll shoot. There was a pause. Then Seward laughed. You won't. Maylin pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. The bullet punched through the door, splintering the wood, and the sound echoed through the cabin like thunder. Silence. Then footsteps, running. The creak of a saddle, the sound of hooves retreating into the distance. Maylin lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Emma stared at her wide-eyed. You shot him. I shot the door, Maylin said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant. But you... The door burst open. Caleb stood there, his gun drawn, his eyes wild. He looked at Maylin, at the rifle in her hands, at the hole in the door. Then he looked past her, scanning the cabin, counting heads. Everyone all right? We're fine, Emma said quickly. Caleb's gaze snapped back to Maylin. What happened? Seward, Maylin said. He came. I told him to leave. He didn't. Caleb's expression went cold. He stepped outside and Maylin heard him moving around the porch, checking the ground, the shadows. When he came back in, his face was granite. He's gone, Caleb said. For now. He closed the door and locked it. Then he crossed to Maylin and took the rifle from her hands. She let him. Her arms felt like water. You did good, Caleb said quietly. Maylin looked at him, at the man who had pulled her out of the snow and given her a place to sleep and taught her how to shoot. The man who was looking at her now like she was something more than a burden. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb nodded. Then he turned to the children. Bed, all of you. They didn't argue. When they were gone, Caleb sat down at the table and poured himself a drink from a bottle he kept in the cupboard. He didn't offer Maylin any, just sat there, staring at the hole in the door. He'll come back, Maylin said. I know. What do we do? Caleb took a long drink. Then he looked at her. We get ready. Caleb spent the next morning nailing boards across the bullet hole. The sound of the hammer echoed through the cabin, sharp, rhythmic, final. Maylin watched from the table where she was kneading bread dough, her hands working the flour and water with more force than necessary. Each strike of the hammer felt like a punctuation mark on a sentence she didn't want to finish. Emma was outside with the children, keeping them occupied with chores that probably didn't need doing. Maylin could hear Samuel's high voice asking questions and Ben's patient answers drifting through the walls. Inside, the silence between hammer blows was thick enough to choke on. When Caleb finished, he stepped back and examined his work. The boards were rough, uneven, but they held. He ran his hand along the edge, testing, then turned to find Maylin watching him. That'll do for now, he said. I'll fix it proper when the weather breaks. Maylin nodded. She shaped the dough into a round and set it in the pan to rise. He won't stop coming. No. Caleb picked up the hammer and carried it to the toolbox by the door. Men like Seward don't stop until they get what they want, or until someone makes them. Then we make him. Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. We? I'm not leaving, Maylin said. The words came out harder than she intended, but she didn't soften them. This is my fight now, too. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot that was always brewing. He didn't offer her any. She'd already had 2 cups. But he stood there, his back to her, holding the cup like it was the only thing keeping his hands occupied. You don't owe me anything, he said finally. I know. Then why? Maylin looked down at her flour-dusted hands. She thought about the alley behind the inn, about the cold that had seeped into her bones, about the moment she'd decided she would rather freeze than beg. Because for the first time since I left San Francisco, someone treated me like I was worth something, and I'm not going to run from that. Caleb turned. His eyes were that pale winter color again, but there was something else in them now, something that looked almost like respect. All right, he said. Then we do this together. The door opened and Emma came in with the children trailing behind her. Samuel's nose was running and Lily's doll was covered in snow. Ben was carrying an armful of firewood that was almost as big as he was, and his face was red with effort. "Drop that by the stove," Caleb said. "Then get washed up, all of you." The children scattered to their tasks, and Emma hung her coat on the peg. She glanced at the boarded-up door, then at Caleb, but she didn't say anything. Just crossed to the basin and started scrubbing her hands. Maylin watched the way Emma moved, efficient, controlled, carrying weight she shouldn't have to carry at 12 years old. It reminded Maylin of herself at that age, standing in her mother's kitchen, learning that love was something you earned through work, not something freely given. That afternoon, while the children napped and Emma read a battered book by the window, Caleb took Maylin outside. The cold hit like a fist. Maylin pulled her borrowed coat tighter and followed Caleb across the yard to the barn. Inside, the horses shifted in their stalls, their breath steaming in the dim light. Caleb led her to the back where he kept his tools and supplies. He pulled a crate down from a shelf and opened it. Inside were boxes of ammunition, a spare revolver, and a long hunting knife in a leather sheath. "You need to know how to use all of this," Caleb said, "not just the rifle." Maylin stared at the contents of the crate. "I don't want to kill anyone." "Neither do I, but wanting and doing are different things." He picked up the revolver and checked the chamber. "Seward's not coming alone next time. He'll bring men, and when he does, you need to be able to protect yourself and those kids." "Why do you think he'll come back?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Because men like him don't like being told no, especially not by a woman." He handed her the revolver. "This is lighter than the rifle, easier to handle in close quarters. You point, you squeeze, you don't think about it." Maylin took the gun. It was cold and heavy in her hand, and she hated the way it felt, hated what it represented. But she didn't put it down. Caleb showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to compensate for the kick. They practiced until her hands stopped shaking and her shots started hitting the targets he'd set up, old cans lined along the fence posts. The sound of gunfire rolled across the snow-covered hills, sharp and violent, and Maylin wondered if anyone heard it, wondered if they cared. When they finished, Caleb took the gun back and tucked it into his belt. "You're a quick learner." "I don't have a choice." "No," Caleb agreed. "I guess you don't." They walked back to the cabin in silence. The sun was starting to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if Maylin had the space in her chest to appreciate it, but all she felt was the weight of what was coming. That evening, after supper, Ben asked Caleb to tell a story. "Don't have any stories," Caleb said, scraping the last of the stew from his bowl. "You always say that," Ben protested, "but you told us about the time you tracked that mountain lion for 3 days." "That wasn't a story, that was just something that happened." "That's what a story is," Emma said dryly. Caleb shot her a look, but there was no heat in it. He set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "All right, but just one." The children leaned forward, even Lily, who clutched her doll and stared at Caleb with those wide, unblinking eyes. Caleb rubbed his jaw, thinking. Then he said, "There was a winter, maybe 10 years back, when the snow came early and stayed late. The drifts were so high you couldn't see the fences, couldn't get to town, couldn't get supplies. Just had to wait it out and hope you had enough to last." "Were you scared?" Samuel asked. "I was practical," Caleb said. "Fear doesn't keep you warm. Work does. So I worked. Chopped wood, tended the animals, fixed what needed fixing. And when the snow finally melted and the roads opened up, I rode into town and found out half the people there hadn't made it. Froze to death or starved because they'd spent their time being afraid instead of preparing." The cabin was quiet. Even Samuel had stopped fidgeting. "What's the point of the story?" Emma asked. Caleb looked at her. "The point is you survive by doing what needs to be done, not by waiting for someone to save you." Maylin felt those words settle over her like a second skin. She thought about the night behind the inn, about the choice she'd made to get up and follow Caleb instead of staying in the cold, about the choice she'd made to pick up the rifle and fire. Survival wasn't passive. It was a series of decisions, each one harder than the last. Later, after the children were asleep and the cabin was dark except for the glow of the stove, Maylin sat by the fire, mending one of Lily's dresses. The fabric was soft and worn, and there was a tear along the hem where Lily had caught it on a nail. Caleb sat across from her, sharpening his knife. The sound of the whetstone was rhythmic, almost soothing. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who understood that words weren't always necessary. Finally, Mei Lin set down the dress and looked at him. "Why did you take them in?" Caleb paused mid-stroke. "The kids?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because no one else would." "That's not an answer." Caleb resumed sharpening the knife. "It's the only one I've got." Mei Lin watched him. Watched the way his hands moved. Steady, sure, practiced. Watched the way the firelight caught the scars on his knuckles and the hard lines of his face. He looked like a man who had been carved down to the essentials, with nothing left but bone and gristle and will. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Caleb looked up. "Do I regret what?" "Taking them in, raising them, giving up whatever life you had before." He considered the question, then he shook his head. "No, I don't regret it." "Why not?" "Because they're still alive, and that's more than they would have been otherwise." Mei Lin thought about that. About the way Emma had said Caleb didn't want them. About the way Ben followed Caleb around like a shadow. About the way Lily's tower kept falling and she kept building it anyway. About Samuel's laughter. Maybe Emma was wrong. Maybe Caleb did care. He just didn't know how to show it in the way people expected. Or maybe he showed it in the only way he knew how. By keeping them safe. By keeping them fed. By being there when no one else was. 3 days later, the snow started falling again. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, quiet snowfall that blanketed everything in fresh white. Caleb went out to check the animals, and Mei Lin helped Emma with the laundry. The water was cold enough to make her fingers ache, but she scrubbed the clothes methodically, wringing them out and hanging them near the stove to dry. Ben and Samuel were playing some kind of game that involved running in circles and making horse sounds. Lily sat in the corner with her blocks, building and rebuilding her tower. The cabin was warm, the stove crackling, the smell of bread baking filling the air. For a moment, Mei Lin let herself believe this was normal, that this was her life now, that the world outside, Seward, Henry Caldwell, the cold, didn't exist. Then the door opened and Caleb came in with snow on his shoulders and a grim expression on his face. "We've got company," he said. Emma's hand stilled on the shirt she was folding. "Who?" "3 riders, coming up the road." Mei Lin's stomach dropped. She crossed to the window and looked out. In the distance, 3 figures on horseback moved through the snow, dark shapes against the white landscape. "Is it Seward?" she asked. "Can't tell from here, but we're not taking chances." Caleb grabbed the rifle from the rack and handed it to Emma. "You know how to use this." Emma took it without hesitation. "Yes." "Good. Get the little ones upstairs. Keep them quiet." Emma herded Ben, Samuel, and Lily toward the ladder. Ben looked back, his face pale, but Emma pushed him forward. "Move!" They climbed. The loft creaked under their weight, and then there was silence. Caleb handed Mei Lin the revolver. "You remember what I taught you?" Mei Lin nodded. Her hands were steady now, steadier than she would have expected. Fear was there, coiled tight in her chest, but it didn't control her anymore. "Stay behind me," Caleb said. "Don't fire unless I tell you to." "All right." Caleb positioned himself by the window, his own gun drawn, and waited. The riders drew closer. Mei Lin could make out details now. 3 men, all of them bundled against the cold, their faces hidden by scarves and hats. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered. Another was smaller, sharper. The third was somewhere in between. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's him. Seward." The rider stopped about 20 yards from the cabin. Seward dismounted and walked forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Caleb Rourke," he called out, his voice carrying across the snow. "I think we got off on the wrong foot the other night." Caleb didn't answer. Seward took another step. "I'm not here for trouble. I'm here to talk." "You can talk from there," Caleb said, his voice flat. Seward stopped. "Fair enough. Look, I know you're protecting the girl. I respect that. But she owes me. And I'm not the kind of man who forgets a debt. She doesn't owe you anything." "That's where you're wrong." Seward's tone was reasonable, almost friendly. "She signed a contract. She agreed to work off her passage. And when she ran, she broke that contract. All I want is what's owed to me. She's not going anywhere with you, Caleb said. Seward sighed. I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this, but I can see you're set on being difficult. He gestured to the two men behind him. Now, I brought my associates here just in case. They're good men, Caleb, former lawmen, both of them. They know how contracts work, and they know what happens when people don't honor their agreements. One of the men dismounted. He was tall, with a face like a slab of granite, and a gun on his hip that looked like it had seen plenty of use. The other stayed on his horse, but his hand rested near his own weapon. Caleb's expression didn't change. You've got 10 seconds to get off my property. Seward smiled. Or what? You'll shoot us? You're outnumbered, friend, and even if you get one of us, the others will get you. Then what happens to those kids you've got hiding upstairs? Mei Lin's breath caught. Caleb's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't raise it. Seward took another step. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over the girl, and we're going to ride out of here peacefully. No one gets hurt. No one has to die. You can go back to your quiet life, and I can go back to mine. Simple as that. No, Mei Lin said. Both men turned to look at her. She stepped out from behind Caleb, the revolver in her hand, and met Seward's gaze. I'm not going with you, she said. Seward's smile faded. You don't have a choice. Yes, I do. Mei Lin raised the gun. Her hands were steady. Her voice was clear. I choose to stay. Seward's eyes narrowed. You think you're brave, shooting through a door? Let's see how brave you are when you're looking me in the eye. I'm looking at you now, Mei Lin said, and I'm telling you to leave. For a moment, no one moved. The snow fell softly around them, muffling the world. The only sound was the wind and the distant creak of saddle leather. Then Caleb spoke. His voice was low, cold, and absolutely certain. You've got 5 seconds, then I start shooting. Seward stared at him, at Mei Lin, at the cabin where 4 children were hiding. Then he stepped back. This isn't over. Yes, Caleb said, it is. Seward's jaw clenched. He turned and walked back to his horse, moving stiffly, like a man swallowing his pride with every step. The 2 men with him exchanged glances, then followed. They mounted up. Seward looked back one last time, his face hard, and then they rode away. Caleb didn't lower his gun until they were out of sight. Then he exhaled slowly and turned to Mei Lin. You shouldn't have stepped out like that. I know, Mei Lin said, but I had to. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, I suppose you did. He went to the ladder and called up to the loft. It's safe. You can come down. The children descended one by one, Emma first, still holding the rifle, then Ben, his face pale, then Samuel, who ran straight to Caleb and wrapped his arms around his legs. Lily came last, clutching her doll, her eyes huge and dark. Are they gone? Ben asked. For now, Caleb said. Will they come back? Emma asked. Maybe. But if they do, we'll be ready. Emma looked at Mei Lin. Something shifted in her expression, not quite trust, but not hostility either. You didn't run. No, Mei Lin said. I didn't. Emma nodded slowly. Then she set the rifle down and turned to start supper, and the moment passed. That night, Mei Lin couldn't sleep. She lay by the stove, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the soft sounds of the children breathing in the loft. Her mind kept replaying the confrontation, Seward's voice, Caleb's steadiness, the weight of the gun in her hand. She'd made a choice today, a real one, not just to stay, but to fight for the right to stay. And for the first time since Henry Caldwell had looked at her like she was worthless, Mei Lin felt like she had claimed something back. Not dignity, she'd never lost that, but agency. The power to decide her own fate. She heard footsteps on the ladder and turned to see Caleb climbing down. He moved quietly, trying not to wake the children, and crossed to the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there, his back to her. Can't sleep either? Mei Lin asked softly. Caleb glanced at her. Never could. Not after something like that. Do you think he'll come back? Probably, but not for a while. He's got to lick his wounds first, figure out a new angle. Caleb took a sip of coffee. Men like Seward, they're used to getting their way. When they don't, it throws them off balance. Takes time to recover. How much time? Enough. Mei Lin sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Enough for what? Caleb was quiet. Then he said, "Enough for you to decide if this is really where you want to be." Maylin frowned. "I already decided." "You decided in the heat of the moment, but when things settle, when the fear fades, you might feel different, might want something more than this." He gestured around the cabin. "A ranch in the middle of nowhere. 4 kids who aren't yours. A man who doesn't talk much and doesn't have much to offer." Maylin looked at him. At the man who had pulled her out of the snow and taught her to shoot and stood beside her when she needed someone to stand with. "You think very little of yourself," she said. Caleb's mouth twitched. "I think realistically." "Then think about this realistically." Maylin stood, letting the quilt fall away, and crossed to where he stood. "I have nothing. No money, no family, no prospects. I came to this country with a promise of a better life, and that promise turned out to be a lie. But here," she gestured around the cabin, "here I have a roof, I have food, I have work, and I have people who don't look at me like I'm something to be used or thrown away. So when I say I'm staying, I'm not saying it out of fear, I'm saying it because I want to." Caleb studied her face. "And what if it gets worse? What if Seward doesn't give up? What if—" "Then we deal with it," Maylin interrupted. "Together, like you said." Caleb was quiet for a long time, then he nodded. "All right, together." He drained his coffee, set the cup down, and climbed back up to the loft. Maylin returned to her makeshift bed by the stove. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes. And this time, she slept. The days that followed were tense. Caleb kept watch, always listening, always alert. He didn't go to town, didn't leave the property unless absolutely necessary. And when he did, he made sure someone else was armed and ready. Maylin fell into the rhythm of the ranch more completely now. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, helped with the animals. Emma stopped questioning her presence. Ben started asking her to tell stories about China. Samuel followed her around like a puppy. And Lily. Lily still didn't speak, but one afternoon she handed Maylin her doll and let Maylin fix the torn seam in its dress. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a gift. One morning, Maylin was in the barn, feeding the horses, when Emma appeared in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said. Maylin looked up. "Of course." Emma hesitated. Then she said, "Why did you stay?" "Really?" Maylin set down the bucket of oats and leaned against the stall door. "Because I was tired of running, and because this felt like the first place I could stop. But you could have gone somewhere else, found another town, another job. Maybe. But I wouldn't have found this." Maylin gestured around the barn. "A place where I'm not just surviving, where I'm living." Emma was quiet. Then she said, "I thought you'd leave, like everyone else." "Who left?" Maylin asked gently. Emma's face closed off. "Doesn't matter." But it did matter. Maylin could see it in the way Emma held herself, in the tightness around her eyes. Someone had left her, and Emma was still carrying that wound. "I'm not leaving," Maylin said. "Not unless you want me to." Emma looked at her, really looked, and something in her face softened. "I don't want you to." Maylin smiled. "Then I'll stay." Emma nodded. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin, her shoulders just a little less rigid than before. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Seward, the weather turned brutal. The temperature dropped so low that the nails in the walls frosted over, and the wind screamed like something dying. Caleb brought the animals into the barn and stuffed the gaps in the walls with hay to keep the heat in. Inside the cabin, everyone huddled close to the stove. The children played quiet games, their breath visible in the air. Maylin and Emma worked side by side, cooking, mending, keeping busy to keep warm. Caleb stood by the window, watching the storm. "How long will this last?" Maylin asked. "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be a week." "Do we have enough supplies?" "We'll make it work." That night, the wind died down, and the cabin fell into an exhausted silence. The children slept in a pile under every blanket they owned, and Caleb dozed in his chair, his gun across his lap. Maylin sat by the stove, unable to sleep, and thought about how far she'd come. From the alley behind the inn to this cabin in the middle of nowhere. From a woman with nothing to a woman with something worth fighting for. She looked at Caleb, at the children, at the life that had somehow become hers. And she thought, this is home. Not because it was perfect, not because it was safe, but because it was real. And because she had chosen it. The storm broke the next morning, and the world outside was transformed. The snow glittered like broken glass under a hard blue sky, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Caleb went out to check the animals, and Mei Lin followed. They worked in silence, moving through the familiar tasks, and when they were done, Caleb stood in the doorway of the barn and looked out at the hills. Spring's still a long way off, he said. I know, Mei Lin said. It'll be hard. Harder than this. I know that too. Caleb looked at her. You sure about this? Mei Lin met his gaze. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Caleb nodded. Then, for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. All right then, he said. Let's get back inside. Those kids are probably tearing the place apart. They walked back to the cabin together, side by side, and Mei Lin felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but certainty. She was home. When they stepped back into the cabin, the warmth hit Mei Lin like an embrace. Samuel was sitting on the floor, building something elaborate with Lily's blocks, while she watched with her usual quiet intensity. Ben had his nose in a book Caleb had brought back from town months ago, something about explorers and mountains. Emma was at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled like potatoes and onions and hope. She looked up when they entered, her gaze moving from Caleb to Mei Lin and back again. Everything all right? Fine, Caleb said. He hung his coat and hat on the pegs, then crossed to the stove to warm his hands. Animals are fed, barn's holding steady. Emma nodded and returned to her stirring, but Mei Lin caught the way her shoulders relaxed, the small exhale of relief. Emma carried so much, this girl who should still be playing with dolls instead of raising children who weren't hers. Mei Lin shed her borrowed coat and moved to the table where a basket of mending waited. She picked up one of Ben's shirts, another tear, this one along the shoulder seam, and threaded her needle. The repetitive motion was soothing, something her hands knew how to do without thought, leaving her mind free to wander. She thought about Caleb's smile in the barn, how rare it was, how it had changed his entire face, making him look younger, less burdened. She wondered what he'd been like before all this, before the children, before whatever life he'd led that put those scars on his knuckles and that wariness in his eyes. Mei Lin? Samuel's voice broke through her thoughts. He was standing beside her now, holding one of the wooden blocks. Can you help me? Help you with what? I'm building a house, but it keeps falling down. Mei Lin set down her mending and knelt beside him on the floor. His tower was ambitious, too tall for its narrow base, destined to collapse under its own weight. She picked up a few blocks and showed him how to widen the foundation, how to distribute the weight evenly. Like this, she said, placing each piece carefully. You build from the ground up, strong at the bottom, then you can go as high as you want. Samuel watched with wide eyes, then tried it himself. His small hands weren't as steady as hers, but he was learning. When the tower held, he clapped his hands and grinned up at her. It worked. Because you built it right, Mei Lin said. Lily, who had been silent as always, reached over and added a block to the top, then another. The tower grew taller, and Samuel bounced on his toes, excited. Even Lily's face showed something that might have been pleasure. Mei Lin returned to her mending, but she kept watching the children, kept seeing the way they existed in this space Caleb had carved out for them. How they'd learned to survive on scraps of affection and consistency. How they were still waiting, all of them, for the next person to leave. She understood that waiting. She'd done it herself for so long. Waited for her mother to say she was worth keeping, waited for the marriage broker to keep his promises, waited for Henry Caldwell to see her as human. All that waiting, and what had it gotten her? Nothing but cold and hunger and shame. But here, she wasn't waiting anymore. She was building, like Samuel's tower, from the ground up. The days shortened as winter deepened its grip on the territory. The sun rose late and set early, and the cold was a living thing that prowled outside the cabin walls, looking for cracks to slip through. Caleb kept the fire going day and night, feeding it logs from the woodpile that shrank a little more each week. Mei Lin learned the rhythms of winter survival. She learned to conserve water, melting snow in pots on the stove, She learned to stretch food, making stews that started with venison and potatoes and ended with broth so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through it. She learned to sew by firelight when the lamp oil ran low, her stitches smaller and more precise than they'd been in San Francisco. She learned, too, the rhythms of this makeshift family. Emma's moods, which shifted like weather, sometimes warm, sometimes stormy, always unpredictable. Ben's endless curiosity, his questions about everything from how snow formed to why the stars didn't fall from the sky. Samuel's need for physical affection, the way he'd climb into anyone's lap and burrow close like a small animal seeking warmth. And Lily's silence, which Mei Lin had come to understand, wasn't emptiness, but a different kind of language. One afternoon, when Caleb and Ben were outside splitting wood and Emma was upstairs organizing the loft, Mei Lin sat with Lily by the window. The girl was staring out at the snow, her doll clutched in her arms, and Mei Lin wondered what she was thinking. What memories lived behind those dark eyes? "Do you like the snow?" Mei Lin asked softly. Lily didn't respond, didn't even blink. Mei Lin tried a different approach. "I'd never seen snow before I came here. In San Francisco it rained, but it never got cold enough for snow. The first time I saw it, I thought it was beautiful, like the sky was falling apart and putting itself back together at the same time." Lily's gaze flickered toward her just for a second, then back to the window. "But now I know it can be dangerous too," Mei Lin continued. "It's beautiful and dangerous at the same time, like a lot of things." Lily's fingers tightened on her doll. Mei Lin didn't push. She just sat there, quiet, present, and after a while Lily leaned against her shoulder. Not much, just a small shift in weight, but it was something. Mei Lin stayed very still, hardly breathing, afraid that any movement would break the spell. They sat like that until Emma called them for supper, and when Lily stood and walked away, she didn't look back. But the warmth of her small body remained on Mei Lin's shoulder like a blessing. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Seward, a rider came. Caleb spotted him from the window just after dawn, a single figure on horseback, moving slowly through the snow. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, his jaw set. "Stay inside," he told Mei Lin. But she followed him onto the porch anyway, the revolver tucked into her skirt pocket, her hand wrapped around its grip. The rider drew closer. He was older, maybe 60, with a gray beard and a weathered face. He wore a star pinned to his coat, a lawman's badge, dull silver in the morning light. Caleb's shoulders tightened, but he didn't raise the rifle. "Sheriff." The man reined in his horse and tipped his hat. "Caleb, miss," he nodded to Mei Lin. "I'm Sheriff Garrett, from town." "I know who you are," Caleb said. "What do you want?" Garrett shifted in his saddle, his breath steaming. "I'm here about a complaint. Man named Seward says you're harboring someone who owes him money. Says she signed a contract and ran out on it." Mei Lin's stomach clenched, but she stepped forward. "I don't owe him anything." Garrett looked at her, his eyes sharp and assessing. "That your position on it?" "That's the truth," Mei Lin said. "He took my money in San Francisco, promised me a husband and a home. But when we got here, the man he sold me to rejected me. Seward kept the money and tried to sell me to a brothel. I didn't run out on a contract. I escaped." Garrett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You got any proof of that?" "Do I need proof? Or is my word not enough because of what I look like?" The sheriff was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'm not here to judge you, miss. I'm here to investigate a complaint. But I'll tell you straight, Seward's not a man I trust. He's been on the edge of the law more times than I can count. So I'm inclined to believe you." He looked at Caleb. "But I need to make sure this is where you want to be, that you're not being held against your will." "But I'm here because I choose to be," Mei Lin said firmly. Garrett studied her face. Then he nodded. "All right, that's good enough for me." He glanced at Caleb. "But Seward's not going to let this go. He's got a reputation to maintain, and you embarrassed him. He'll be back, and next time he might not come alone." "Let him come," Caleb said quietly. Garrett's mouth twitched. "You always were a stubborn one, Caleb." He gathered his reins. "I'll tell Seward I investigated and found no wrongdoing. That should buy you some time. But watch your back. Both of you." "We will," Caleb said. The sheriff tipped his hat again and turned his horse. As he rode away, Mei Lin felt Caleb's hand on her shoulder, brief, steadying. "You did good," he said. Mei Lin watched the sheriff disappear into the trees. "He'll come back," Seward. "I know." "What do we do?" Caleb's hand dropped. "We wait, and we stay ready." They went back inside, and Mei Lin helped Emma with breakfast while Caleb explained to the children what had happened. Ben looked worried. Emma's face went hard. Samuel asked if they were going to have to fight, and Lily just stared at her blocks. "We're going to be fine," Caleb said, "but we need to be smart. No one goes outside alone. No one opens the door unless they know who's on the other side. Understood?" The children nodded, and life continued tense and careful, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. The week that followed was quiet. Too quiet. Mei Lin found herself listening for hoofbeats, for voices, for anything that might signal Seward's return. But the only sounds were the wind and the creak of the cabin settling and the soft murmur of children's voices. She threw herself into work. She cleaned the cabin until it gleamed. She mended every piece of clothing in the basket and started on things that didn't need mending. She cooked elaborate meals with limited ingredients, trying to coax variety from monotony. She did anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. Emma noticed. "You're going to work yourself to death." Mei Lin looked up from the shirt she was hemming. "I need to stay busy." "Why?" "Because if I stop, I'll think. And if I think, I'll be afraid." Emma set down the pot she was scrubbing and turned. "Being afraid isn't the worst thing. Sometimes it keeps you alive." "And sometimes it keeps you frozen," Mei Lin said. "I spent too long being afraid. I'm done with it." Emma studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "You're braver than you think." Mei Lin shook her head. "I'm not brave. I just don't have any other choice." "That's what brave is," Emma said quietly. "Doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Mei Lin looked at this girl who carried the weight of 4 lives on her narrow shoulders, who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who still found ways to be kind, even when kindness had never been shown to her. "You would know." Emma's face softened just slightly. Then she turned back to her pot, and the moment passed. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb came down from the loft and found Mei Lin sitting by the fire. She was holding something in her hands, a small wooden horse that Samuel had left on the floor. Caleb sat down across from her. "You all right?" "I keep thinking about what the sheriff said, that Seward won't let this go." "He won't." "So what happens when he comes back?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We fight, or we run. Those are the only 2 choices." "I won't run," Mei Lin said. "Not again." "Then we fight." Mei Lin looked at him. At this man who'd taken in children no one else wanted, who'd pulled her out of the snow when he could have left her there, who stood between his makeshift family and the world with nothing but a rifle and his own stubborn will. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "That first night. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. So why?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "You want the truth?" "Always." He was silent for a moment, his gaze on the fire. Then he said, "I saw someone who refused to quit, who was freezing to death but still had enough fight left to spit in a man's face. And I thought, that's someone worth saving." Mei Lin's throat tightened. "I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just too angry to die." "Sometimes that's the same thing." Caleb looked at her. "You remind me of Emma, the way she was when I found her." "What happened to her?" Caleb's expression darkened. "Her father sold her to a man who wanted a servant, not a daughter. She ran, got as far as the edge of town before they caught her. Sheriff brought her to me, said she was too wild for the orphanage, asked if I'd take her." "And you did." "And I did." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She didn't talk for the first month, just worked, cleaned, cooked, did everything she could to make herself useful, like if she stopped working, I'd send her back." Mei Lin understood that feeling. "How did you get her to trust you?" "I didn't, not at first." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "But I showed up. Every day I was there, and eventually she started to believe it, that I wasn't going to leave, that she didn't have to earn her place here." "Do you think she believes it now?" "Some days." Caleb looked toward the loft where the children slept. And some days I think she's still waiting for me to prove her right, to leave, to give up. Mei Lin set the wooden horse on the table between them. You won't. No, Caleb said. I won't. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside. Then Mei Lin said, If we're going to fight, I need to know something. What? What we're fighting for. Is it just survival, or is it something more? Caleb looked at her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. What do you want it to be? Mei Lin thought about that. About the children upstairs, about Emma's hard-won trust and Ben's curiosity and Samuel's laughter and Lily's silence. About this cabin in the middle of nowhere that had somehow become the first place she'd felt safe in years. I want it to be home, she said softly. Not just a place we're staying, but home. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, then that's what we're fighting for. The cold broke 2 days later. It wasn't spring. Winter still had months left to run. But the temperature rose just enough for the ice to soften and the snow to turn wet and heavy. The sun came out, pale and watery, and the children begged to go outside. Caleb relented, but only with conditions. Everyone stayed within sight of the cabin. No one went near the woods, and Caleb kept his rifle close. Ben and Samuel built a fort out of snow, their voices high and excited. Emma helped Lily make a small snowman, showing her how to pack the snow tight. And Mei Lin stood on the porch, watching, the revolver still in her pocket, but her heart a little lighter than it had been. Caleb came to stand beside her. You thinking about something? Just watching. Watching what? Them. Mei Lin gestured toward the children. Being children. I don't think they get to do that very often. Caleb's expression softened. No, they don't. They stood together, silent, and Mei Lin realized this was the first time in weeks she'd felt something other than fear or determination. She felt almost peaceful, almost content. Then Ben shouted, Riders! The peace shattered. Caleb grabbed his rifle and was down the porch steps before Mei Lin could move. Emma, get them inside, now! Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lily and Samuel and ran for the cabin. Ben followed, his face pale. Mei Lin held the door open, counting heads as they rushed past, then slammed it shut and threw the bolt. Through the window, she could see Caleb standing in the yard, his rifle raised. And coming down the road were 4 riders, moving fast. Mei Lin's heart hammered against her ribs. She positioned herself by the window, the revolver in her hand, and waited. The riders slowed as they approached. Seward was in front, his face hard and furious. Behind him were 3 men she didn't recognize. Rough-looking, armed, the kind of men who got paid to make problems disappear. Seward reined in his horse 20 feet from Caleb. I'm done playing games, Rourke. Then leave, Caleb said. Not without what's mine. Seward pointed toward the cabin. The girl signed a contract. She owes me, and I'm collecting. She doesn't owe you anything, Caleb said. Sheriff came by. He agrees. Seward's smile was thin and cruel. Sheriff's opinion doesn't matter out here. Only mine does. He gestured to the men behind him. These gentlemen are here to make sure I get what I'm owed. You can hand her over peacefully, or we can take her. Your choice. One of the men shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on his gun. The others spread out, flanking Caleb from 3 sides. Mei Lin's breath came short and fast. Emma was behind her, holding Samuel and Lily close. Ben stood near the rifle rack, his face pale but determined. Don't open that door, Emma whispered, no matter what happens. But Mei Lin was already moving. She unlocked the bolt and stepped onto the porch. Mei Lin, no. Emma's voice was sharp, but Mei Lin didn't stop. She walked down the steps and crossed the yard to stand beside Caleb. His jaw tightened, but he didn't tell her to go back inside. Seward's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. There she is. Come on, girl. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not going with you, Mei Lin said. Her voice was steady, clear, and she kept the revolver at her side where everyone could see it. You don't have a choice. Yes, I do. Mei Lin raised the gun. I have this. Seward laughed. You going to shoot all 4 of us? If I have to. The men behind Seward shifted, their hands moving toward their weapons. Caleb's rifle swung to cover the closest one. First man who draws gets a bullet, Caleb said quietly. Second man gets one too. Maybe I don't get all four of you, but I'll get enough. Seward's smile faded. You die for her? For some Chinese whore who doesn't mean anything to you? Caleb's expression went cold. She means something to me. And yeah, I'd die for that. Maylin felt something crack open in her chest. She glanced at Caleb, saw the set of his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes, and understood that he meant it. He would die for this. For her. For the choice she'd made to stay. You're a fool, Seward said. Maybe, Caleb said. But I'm a fool with a rifle, and you're trespassing on my land. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came right before violence. Maylin could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could see the calculation in Seward's eyes as he weighed his options. Then one of the men behind Seward spoke. This ain't worth it, boss. Rourke's got the high ground, and he's a dead shot. We go for our guns, at least two of us die. Maybe all of us. Seward's face flushed. You're paying us to collect a debt, not to die for it. The man turned his horse. Find another way to get your money back. This one's a losing bet. The other two men exchanged glances, then followed. Seward sat alone on his horse, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. This isn't over, he spat. Yes, Caleb said. It is. You come back here again. I won't warn you. I'll just shoot you. And then I'll bury you so far out in the hills no one will ever find your body. Seward stared at him. Then he jerked his horse around and galloped away, leaving a spray of snow in his wake. Caleb didn't lower his rifle until they were out of sight. Then he exhaled slowly and turned to Maylin. You shouldn't have come out here. I wasn't going to let you face them alone. I've faced worse. I know, but you don't have to anymore. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Let's get inside. They walked back to the cabin together, and when they stepped through the door, Emma was standing there with tears on her face. She didn't say anything, just threw her arms around Maylin and held on tight. Maylin stood there, stunned, and then she wrapped her arms around Emma and held her back. Ben and Samuel crowded close, and even Lily reached out to touch Maylin's hand. They stood like that, all of them together, and Maylin felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she belonged. That night, when the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Caleb sat across from Maylin at the table. He poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across to her. I meant what I said out there, he said. I know. You matter. To me. To them. He gestured toward the loft. You're part of this now, whether you plan to be or not. Maylin wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her skin. I didn't plan any of this. Neither did I. Caleb took a sip of his coffee. But here we are. Here we are, Maylin echoed. They sat in silence for a while. Then Caleb said, I don't know how to do this. Do what? This. He gestured between them. I'm not good at talking, at saying what I mean, at being anything other than what I am. Maylin looked at him, at this man who spoke more through action than words, who showed love by keeping people safe and fed and warm. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. And what's that? Enough, Maylin said simply. Caleb's throat worked. Then he nodded. You too. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. But it was real. And that was all Maylin needed. The weeks that followed Seward's retreat were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the tense silence of waiting for danger, but the settled hush of a house learning to breathe. The children relaxed, degree by degree. Samuel's laughter came more easily. Ben stopped checking the windows every few minutes. Even Emma's shoulders lost some of their permanent tension. Maylin felt the shift too. She moved through the cabin with a lightness she hadn't known she was capable of, and when she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Her face had filled out slightly from regular meals. Her hands were rough from work, but steady. And her eyes held something that looked almost like peace. One morning in late February, she woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window with his coffee. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Couldn't sleep? She asked, rising from her bed by the stove. Thinking, Caleb said. About what? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, About how this works. Long term. Maylin's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Caleb turned to face her. You've been here almost 2 months? You've proven yourself 10 times over. But we've never talked about what comes next, what you want, what I can offer. I don't need... Let me finish. Caleb set down his cup. I'm not good at this. At saying things that matter, but I need you to understand something. You're not a guest here anymore. You're not someone I'm sheltering out of duty. He struggled for the words. You're part of this family, and I want you to stay, not just for now, for as long as you want to be here. Maylin's throat tightened. Caleb, I can't offer you much, he continued. This ranch, it's small. The work's hard. The winters are brutal. And I'm not the kind of man who knows how to court a woman properly. I don't know how to make pretty speeches or promises about the future. All I know is that when I look at you, I see someone who's as much a part of this place as I am. Someone who makes it feel less like surviving and more like living. Maylin crossed the room to stand in front of him. Are you asking me to marry you? Caleb's jaw worked. I'm asking if you'd consider it, not because you owe me, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to. Because this feels right to you the way it does to me. Maylin looked into his pale eyes and saw the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection that he was trying so hard to hide. This man who'd faced down armed men without flinching was terrified of her answer. I don't need pretty speeches, she said softly. I never did. What I need is someone who shows up, someone who stands beside me when things get hard, someone who sees me as I am and doesn't turn away. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. You've already given me that, so yes, I'll marry you. Caleb's expression broke open. Relief, joy, something deeper that had no name. He pulled her close, and Maylin rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I won't let you down, he murmured into her hair. I know, Maylin said, and I won't let you down either. They stood like that until the sun was fully up and they heard stirring from the loft above. Then they pulled apart and Caleb went to stoke the fire while Maylin started breakfast, and everything was different and exactly the same. When they told the children, the reactions were mixed. Samuel whooped and jumped up and down until Caleb told him to settle down. Ben grinned and asked if that meant Maylin was staying forever. Lily watched with her wide, dark eyes, and then did something she'd never done before. She smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Emma was quiet. She looked at Maylin, then at Caleb, and her expression was unreadable. You're really staying? She asked. I'm really staying, Maylin said. Emma nodded slowly. Then she turned and went back to the stove, but Maylin caught the shine in her eyes before she turned away. Later, when they were alone in the kitchen, Emma spoke without looking up from the bread dough she was kneading. I thought you'd leave. Everyone always leaves. I'm not everyone, Maylin said gently. No, Emma's hands stilled. You're not. She looked up and her eyes were fierce. But if you hurt him, if you hurt any of them, I'll make you regret it. Maylin didn't smile, didn't soften the moment with reassurance. She just met Emma's gaze straight on. I won't. You have my word. Emma studied her face for a long moment. Then she nodded and went back to her kneading, and Maylin knew she'd just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. They were married 3 weeks later, on a clear March morning when the sun was bright and the snow was starting to melt at the edges. There was no church, no minister, no witnesses except the children and Sheriff Garrett, who rode out from town to make it official. They stood in front of the cabin, and the sheriff read the words from a small book he carried, and when he asked if they took each other, they both said yes. Caleb slipped a ring onto Maylin's finger, simple silver, slightly too large but worn with care. It had belonged to his mother, he told her quietly. It was the only thing of value he had to give. Maylin looked at the ring, then at Caleb, and felt something settle deep in her chest. This was real. This was hers. Not because someone had promised it to her, or because she'd paid for it, or because she'd been sold into it, but because she'd chosen it. You may kiss your bride, Sheriff Garrett said with a small smile. Caleb looked almost embarrassed, but he leaned down and pressed his lips to Maylin's, brief and gentle. The children cheered, and even Emma clapped, and Maylin felt tears prick her eyes. After the sheriff left, they had a small celebration. Emma had made a cake, lopsided and slightly burned on one side, but sweet nonetheless. Ben gave Mei Lin a drawing he'd made of the whole family standing in front of the cabin. Samuel presented her with a rock he'd found that was special for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, and Lily, silent as always, walked over and placed her doll in Mei Lin's hands. Mei Lin knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. "Are you sure?" Lily nodded. "Just for today? Or do you want me to keep her?" Lily's small hand reached out and touched Mei Lin's cheek. Then she wrapped her arms around Mei Lin's neck and held on tight. It was the first time Lily had initiated touch with anyone. Mei Lin's eyes filled with tears, and she held the girl close, feeling the fragile weight of her trust. "I'll take good care of her," Mei Lin whispered. "I promise." When Lily pulled back, her eyes were shining, and there was something in her face that looked almost like hope. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb and Mei Lin sat by the fire. He'd given her his bed in the loft, insisting he'd sleep by the stove until they could build an addition to the cabin come spring. But Mei Lin had refused. "We're married now," she'd said. "We share everything, including a bed." So they climbed the ladder together, and Caleb showed her the small space he'd carved out for himself over the years. It was sparse. A narrow bed, a trunk for his clothes, a shelf with a few books, and a photograph of a woman Mei Lin didn't recognize. "My mother," Caleb said when he saw her looking. "She died when I was 15. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots. "But I kept the picture, to remember what it felt like to have a home." Mei Lin sat beside him. "Do you have that now? A home?" Caleb looked at her, and his expression was softer than she'd ever seen it. "Yeah, I do." They lay down together, awkward at first, figuring out how two people who'd spent so long alone learned to share space. But eventually they settled, Mei Lin's head on Caleb's shoulder, his arm around her, and the warmth between them chased away the last of the cold. "Thank you," Mei Lin whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing me. When everyone else looked through me, you saw me." Caleb's arm tightened around her. "You made yourself hard to miss." Mei Lin smiled against his chest. Then she closed her eyes and let herself fall asleep, safe and warm and home. Spring came slowly to the Wyoming territory, but when it came with a vengeance. The snow melted in rushing rivers that carved new paths through the hills. The ground softened, and green shoots pushed through the mud. The air lost its bite and turned sweet with the smell of pine and wet earth. And the work, which had been about survival all winter, became about building. Caleb and Ben started construction on an addition to the cabin, a room for Caleb and Mei Lin, so the children could have the loft to themselves. It was slow going, just the two of them working in the evenings after the day's chores were done, but the frame started to take shape. Mei Lin worked the garden, turning over the soil and planting seeds Emma had saved from the previous year. She'd never grown anything before, but she learned quickly, following Emma's instructions about spacing and depth and watering. Her hands, already tough from winter work, developed new calluses, and her back ached from bending over rows of earth. But she didn't mind. This was building too. Building a future, one seed at a time. One afternoon in early April, a wagon appeared on the road. Mei Lin was in the garden, and she straightened when she saw it, her hand instinctively moving to the revolver she now wore at her hip. But as the wagon drew closer, she saw it was driven by a woman, middle-aged, with graying hair and a kind face, and beside her sat a young man who looked to be about 20. Caleb came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "Can I help you?" The woman pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "Are you Caleb Rourke?" "I am. My name is Margaret Wells. This is my son, Thomas." She gestured to the young man, who nodded politely. "We heard you took in children, ones who had nowhere else to go." Caleb's expression became guarded. "Where'd you hear that?" "Sheriff Garrett. He said you were a good man, that you gave kids a chance when no one else would." Margaret's voice wavered slightly. "My husband died last fall. We lost the farm. I've been trying to find work, but no one wants to hire a woman with a child. And Thomas, he's a good boy, but he's not quite right in the head. Simple, they call him. He can work, but he needs someone patient. someone who won't give up on him. She looked at Caleb with desperate hope. I heard you married recently. I thought maybe with a woman in the house, you might have room for one more. Just until I can get back on my feet. I can pay. Not much, but something. And Thomas can work. He's strong, and he listens well. Caleb glanced at Mei Lin. She saw the question in his eyes, the uncertainty. They already had 4 children. The cabin was crowded, resources were tight, but she also saw the boy's face, open, trusting, waiting to be rejected like he'd probably been rejected 100 times before. And she thought about how she'd felt in that alley, unwanted and discarded. She walked over to Caleb and took his hand. Then she looked at Margaret. How old is Thomas? 20, ma'am. And he can follow instructions? Yes, ma'am. He's a hard worker, just needs things explained clearly. Mei Lin looked at the boy. Thomas, do you like animals? Thomas's face lit up. Yes, ma'am. I like horses and cows and chickens, and we have all of those, Mei Lin said. And we could use help with them. Would you like to stay for supper, meet the other children, see if this is a place you'd want to be? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You mean it? Mei Lin squeezed Caleb's hand, and he nodded. We mean it, he said. Can't promise it'll be permanent, but we can try. Margaret pressed her hands to her mouth, overcome. Thomas climbed down from the wagon and walked over to Caleb, extending his hand. Thank you, sir, he said earnestly. I'll work real hard, I promise. Caleb shook his hand. I believe you will. They invited Margaret to stay for supper, and the cabin was more crowded than ever that night, but somehow it didn't feel cramped. It felt full. The children were curious about Thomas, asking him questions and showing him their treasures. Thomas answered patiently, his smile wide and genuine, and by the end of the meal, Samuel was sitting on his lap and Lily was showing him her blocks. When Margaret left, promising to return in a week to check on Thomas, the boy stood on the porch and waved until her wagon disappeared from sight. Then he turned to Caleb with wet eyes. No one ever gave me a chance before, he said quietly. Well, Caleb said, clapping him on the shoulder. We're giving you one now. Don't waste it. I won't, sir. I promise. And he didn't. Thomas threw himself into the work with enthusiasm that bordered on joy. He mucked out stalls, hauled water, chopped wood, and helped Ben with the heavy lifting on the addition. He was slower than Ben at some tasks, and he needed things explained more than once, but he never complained, and he never quit. The children adored him. He was gentle with Lily, patient with Samuel, and he looked at Emma like she hung the moon. And when he wasn't working, he was whittling small animals that he gave to the children, each one more detailed than the last. One evening, Mei Lin found him on the porch, carving a horse for Samuel. She sat beside him, watching his hands work the wood with surprising skill. You're good at this, she said. Thomas ducked his head, embarrassed. My pa taught me, before he died. He taught you well. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Why did you let me stay? You didn't have to. Mei Lin thought about how to answer. Then she said, Because everyone deserves a place where they're wanted, and because this house has room for people who need it. Even people like me. Especially people like you. Thomas looked at her, his eyes shining. You're a good person, ma'am. Mei Lin shook her head. I'm just someone who knows what it feels like to have nowhere to go. And I don't want anyone else to feel that way if I can help it. Thomas went back to his carving, and Mei Lin sat with him until the sun set, and Caleb called them in for supper. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and endless daylight. The garden flourished under Mei Lin's care, producing more vegetables than she'd dared hope for. The addition to the cabin was completed, giving Caleb and Mei Lin their own space for the first time, and the ranch, which had felt like it was barely holding together through winter, started to feel like it was thriving. Margaret Wells came to visit every few weeks, and each time she stayed a little longer, helping with the cooking and the mending and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a household running. She and Mei Lin became friends, 2 women who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from nothing. One afternoon, Margaret pulled Mei Lin aside. I don't know how to thank you. Thomas is happier than I've ever seen him, and you've given him something I never could. A place where he belongs. He's earned it, Mei Lin said. He works harder than anyone I've ever met. But you gave him the chance. Most people wouldn't have. Margaret's voice grew thick. Most people took one look at him and decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Mei Lin thought about Henry Caldwell's face when he'd looked at her, the disgust, the dismissal. I know what that feels like. Margaret squeezed her hand. You're a remarkable woman, Mei Lin Rourke. Mei Lin smiled at the sound of her new name. It still felt strange sometimes, but it was growing familiar, like a coat that had been too big at first but was slowly molding to fit. In July, Sheriff Garrett rode out with news. Seward was dead. He'd been killed in a saloon fight in a town 2 territories over, shot by a man he'd tried to cheat at cards. There would be no more threats, no more looking over their shoulders. The news should have brought relief, but instead Mei Lin felt oddly hollow. She'd spent so long bracing for Seward's return that his absence felt almost anticlimactic. That night, she stood on the porch, looking out at the hills that rolled away into darkness, and Caleb came to stand beside her. You all right? He asked. I don't know, Mei Lin said honestly. I thought I'd feel different, safer maybe, but mostly I just feel tired. You've been carrying fear for months, Caleb said. It doesn't disappear just because the threat does. Give it time. Mei Lin leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her. I never thanked you properly, she said. For what? For standing with me, against Seward. Against everyone who said I didn't belong here. You could have sent me away a dozen times. It would have been easier, but you didn't. Caleb's arm tightened. Easier isn't always better. And you made this place better, made me better. So if anyone should be thanking anyone, it's me thanking you. Mei Lin turned to look at him. For what? For choosing to stay. For choosing us. Caleb's pale eyes caught the moonlight. For choosing me. Mei Lin reached up and kissed him, soft and lingering, and when they pulled apart, she saw something in his face that made her heart ache in the best possible way. Love. Clear and uncomplicated and real. I'll always choose you, she whispered. Good, Caleb said, because I'm not letting you go. They stood together under the stars, and Mei Lin felt the last piece of fear fall away. She was home. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she wanted to be. As autumn approached and the leaves began to turn, Mei Lin realized she was pregnant. She told Caleb first, late one night when they were alone in their room. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. Are you happy? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Happy doesn't cover it, Caleb said roughly. Terrified, grateful, both at the same time. Mei Lin pulled back to look at him. You'll be a good father, you already are. Those kids aren't mine by blood. Blood doesn't make a father, Mei Lin said firmly. Showing up does. Being there does. And you've done that for 4 children who weren't yours. You'll do it for this one too. Caleb cupped her face in his hands. We'll do it. Together. When they told the children, the reactions were predictably chaotic. Samuel wanted to know if the baby would be a boy or a girl, and could he teach it to ride horses. Ben asked serious questions about when it would arrive and whether they'd need to build another edition. Emma's face went soft in a way Mei Lin had never seen before, and she asked quietly if she could help when the time came. And Lily? Lily walked over to Mei Lin and placed her small hand on Mei Lin's still flat stomach, then looked up with those dark eyes and smiled. Thomas carved a cradle, working on it every evening for weeks until it was perfect. Margaret sewed tiny clothes, her fingers flying through fabric with practiced skill, and the whole household rearranged itself to prepare for this new life that was coming. Winter returned, but it felt different this year. Not like an enemy to be survived, but like a season to be endured with the knowledge that spring would come again. Mei Lin's belly grew round, and Caleb became fiercely protective, hardly letting her lift anything heavier than a spoon. The children took over her chores without being asked, and Emma became her shadow, making sure she rested and ate and didn't overwork herself. On a cold December morning, when the snow was falling soft and silent and the cabin was warm with firelight, Lily spoke for the first time. Mei Lin was sitting in the rocking chair Caleb had made for her, her hands resting on her swollen belly, when Lily climbed into her lap, carefully, as if afraid of hurting the baby. "Mama?" Lily whispered. The word hung in the air like a blessing. Mei Lin's eyes filled with tears. She wrapped her arms around Lily and held her close. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here." Lily burrowed against her, and Mei Lin felt the little girl's tears soaking through her dress. She rocked her gently, whispering comfort, and when Caleb came in from the barn and saw them, he stopped in the doorway, his face breaking open with emotion. Emma was crying too, and Ben and even Thomas had wet eyes. Samuel didn't understand what was happening, but he came over and hugged both Mei Lin and Lily, adding his warmth to the moment. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb held Mei Lin in bed and whispered, "A year ago, I never could have imagined this." "Imagined what?" Mei Lin asked, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was kicking. "This, all of it. A full house, a wife, a child on the way. I thought I'd just keep doing what I was doing. Taking in strays, giving them a place to stay until they could move on. I never thought," his voice caught, "I never thought I'd have a family. A real one." Mei Lin turned in his arms so she could see his face. "You had a family before I came. Those children love you." "I know, but you made it complete. You made it feel like we weren't just surviving together, like we were actually living." Mei Lin kissed him softly. "We are living, and we're going to keep living, all of us, together." The baby came in late February, on a night when the stars were bright and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. Margaret had arrived 2 weeks earlier to help with the birth, and it was her steady hands that guided Mei Lin through the long hours of labor. Emma stayed by Mei Lin's side the whole time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. And Caleb paced outside the room, his face pale with worry, while the other children waited in the kitchen. When the baby finally came, a girl, tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire territory, Mei Lin held her and wept. "She's beautiful," Margaret said, tears streaming down her own face. Emma leaned over to look at the baby, her expression full of wonder. "What are you going to name her?" Mei Lin looked at Caleb, who had finally been allowed into the room and was standing beside the bed, staring at his daughter like she was made of light. "Hope," Mei Lin said softly. "Her name is Hope." Caleb touched the baby's tiny hand, and when her fingers wrapped around his eyes filled with tears. "Hope," he repeated. "It's perfect." The children came in one by one to meet their new sister. Ben was careful and gentle, asking if he could hold her. Samuel bounced on his toes with excitement, but was surprisingly quiet when Mei Lin placed Hope in his arms. Thomas stood back, awed and nervous, until Mei Lin invited him closer. And Lily climbed onto the bed and curled up next to Mei Lin, staring at the baby with wonder. "She's so small," Lily whispered. "She is," Mei Lin agreed, "but she'll grow, just like you." Lily reached out and touched Hope's cheek with one finger, infinitely gentle. "I'll protect her," she said solemnly. "I know you will," Mei Lin said. "We all will." The year turned toward spring, and life settled into a new rhythm. Hope grew fat and healthy, her cries filling the cabin at all hours. Emma became her second mother, constantly checking on her and helping with feedings. Lily sang to her, soft, wordless melodies that seemed to calm the baby when nothing else would. Ben read to her from his books, even though she was too young to understand, and Samuel made her laugh with faces and sounds that were completely ridiculous but somehow perfect. Thomas carved toys for her, and Margaret knitted blankets. Caleb built a cradle that rocked with the slightest touch, and he spent hours just watching his daughter sleep, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. And Mei Lin watched all of it with a heart so full it hurt. She'd come to this territory with nothing, less than nothing. She'd been rejected, abandoned, left to freeze in an alley behind an inn on Christmas Eve. But she'd survived. More than that, she'd built something. A life. A family. A home. One evening in early summer, when Hope was 4 months old and the garden was in full bloom and the house was full of noise and laughter and life, Mei Lin stood on the porch and looked out at the land she now called her own. Caleb came to stand beside her, Hope asleep against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Mei Lin smiled. "About how far I've come. From that alley to here. Doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real," Caleb said. "You made it real." "We made it real," Mei Lin corrected. "All of us." From inside the cabin, she could hear Emma scolding Ben for tracking mud across the floor. Samuel's laughter. Lily's soft voice reading to Thomas. The sounds of a family. Her family. Caleb shifted Hope to his other shoulder and took Mei Lin's hand. I never told you this, but that night I found you. I almost didn't stop. I was tired, it was late, and I just wanted to get home. But something made me turn down that alley, made me look. I'm glad you did, Mei Lin said quietly. So am I. Caleb squeezed her hand. Because finding you, it was like finding the missing piece I didn't know I was looking for. You made this place a home. You made me remember what it feels like to be more than just a man going through the motions. Mei Lin leaned her head on his shoulder, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. You saved my life. No, Caleb said. You saved your own life. I just gave you a place to do it. They stood together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Hope sighed in her sleep, and from inside the cabin came the sound of dishes clattering and children arguing about whose turn it was to dry. It was messy and chaotic and imperfect. It was home. And as Mei Lin watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, she thought about that Christmas Eve a year and a half ago, about the woman in the red wedding dress who had refused to give up, who had chosen dignity over desperation, who had spit in a man's face rather than surrender. That woman had been brave, but she'd also been broken, alone, barely holding on. The woman Mei Lin was now, she was whole, not because someone had fixed her, but because she'd fixed herself, because she'd chosen to get up when Caleb offered his hand, because she'd chosen to stay when staying was hard, because she'd chosen to fight for a place that felt like home. And now, standing on this porch with her husband and her daughter and her found family all around her, Mei Lin understood something she'd never quite grasped before. Home wasn't a place you were given. It was something you built, piece by piece, choice by choice, day by day. And she had built this. They all had. Together. Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple. Come on, let's get inside before Emma burns whatever she's cooking. Mei Lin laughed. It's your turn to cook. Right, then let's get inside before I burn whatever I'm cooking. They walked into the cabin together, and the door closed behind them, shutting out the night and the cold and all the darkness that had come before. Inside was warmth. Inside was light. Inside was laughter and love, and the beautiful, messy chaos of a family that had chosen each other. Inside was home. And Mei Lin had never been more grateful for anything in her entire life.